Iran does have the potential to strike back at U.S. facilities and allied and Israeli facilities in the region. So, this is again a scenario where, supporting the protesters through strikes may lead to unintended or undesirable consequences as Iran retaliates against those strikes.
Hi, I'm Jo Crawford and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I'm joined by Lewis Lukens, former acting US ambassador to the UK and now senior partner with Signum Global Advisors. Thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Hi, Joe. Good to see you again.
So we've just seen Donald Trump make a post on Truth Social where he told demonstrators in Iran to keep protesting and that help is on the way. What do you think he's referring to when he says that help is on the way?
Well, you never quite know with Donald Trump, right? Do you? What he's referring to? I assume he is referring to U.S. help and possible U.S. Some form of military support for the protesters and against the regime. The challenge, I think, is that there is no viable U.S. military force in the region right now. So if he's telling the protesters to wait and to hold on, they could be holding on for quite a while. The U.S. Navy, as you know, is very much focused in the Caribbean right now off the coast of Venezuela. And it will take a while to preposition or to reposition ships so that they could support any kind of military action against an Iranian regime. If Trump is even considering that, which we don't. I mean, he may be considering it, but I don't think any decision has been made yet to get militarily involved in these protests.
Potentially Trump is being briefed about options for either some sort of potential US intervention, whether that be potential airstrikes, or on the other hand, could this be something to do with cyber warfare or psychological operations? If we look back to last year when we had the US striking Iranian nuclear facilities, do you think that gives us any indication of how Trump might be acting here?
Well, it's a very different scenario. I mean, obviously, it does set the precedent that Trump is willing to attack Iran, and he perhaps feels emboldened because he considers that attack to have been a success. But the logistics and the challenges around striking the Iranian military that is in the process of suppressing civilian protests is much more difficult. And I think there's some real risks involved in the U.S. getting involved militarily, which I'm sure is part of the briefing that President Trump is getting, including, the potential that by the time forces get there, U.S. forces are able to strike, that the protests have died down. So then it looks less like you're supporting the protesters and more like you're just attacking the Iranian regime. The possibility of civilian casualties if strikes go off target. So there are a lot of challenges to it that I think the president and his team are probably considering right now.
And what would you say would be the wider consequences of that within the region?
Well, this is another one of the challenges that I think his team is considering, is that there are Iran does have the potential to strike back at U.S. facilities and allied and Israeli facilities in the region. So, this is, again, a scenario where, supporting the protesters through strikes may lead to unintended or undesirable consequences as Iran retaliates against those strikes. I mean, in a very simplistic way, you could argue you support the protesters by striking, the regime collapses, democracy takes over Iran. But, that is a very remote scenario, I think. And there are a lot of scenarios that we would see before we got there that would have some difficult consequences, I think, for Israel and for the U.S. in the region.
Can you take any guesses or any assumptions of how you think things are going to play out? What are the steps you expect the president to be taking in the White House as it stands?
Well, I mean, he'll be talking to Marco Rubio, certainly, and to Pete Hegseth at the Department of Defense. I wouldn't be surprised to see some movement of U.S. forces back to the Middle East from the Caribbean. But again, Trump's in a bit of a bind here because the situation in Venezuela is not completely resolved either. And he still he seems to want to be able to sort of not threaten, but basically to have this overwhelming U.S. force off the coast to make the point that this new regime that is settling in or this slightly different variation of the regime that's settling in Caracas understands that the U.S. is right here and looking over your shoulder. So, Trump has to decide where he wants to deploy his forces and what's the best use of them. But I wouldn't be surprised if, the discussion that is happening with his senior advisors right now is around, how can we best apply pressure on the Iranian regime and show support for the demonstrators, which I think he genuinely wants to do, but without leading to a situation where, as Colin Powell said, you break it, you own it. That was I think he called it the Pottery Barn mantra. But we don't want to end up. Trump does not want to end up with rebuilding democracy in anywhere in the Middle East, especially in Iran.
I mean, we heard from the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. He said that he believed that the Iranian government is in its final days and weeks. If Merz is right and the Iranian government was to fall, for example, how do you see the US reacting to this? But also, what sort of problems would instability in the region create for the US as well?
If that were to happen, and I think we're skeptical, I think there are a lot of it is hard to imagine right now a scenario where the regime falls, because the regime is not going to kind of give up on its own, I don't think. Khomeini's been in power for over 40 years. There are other ways that this could happen, but they're all fairly low odds scenarios. But if it were to happen, I think Donald Trump would find himself in a pretty sticky situation, because his inclination, I think, his personality would be to kind of claim success, claim ownership of that success. But then, we don't know what the post-regime landscape looks like in Iran, and it could be quite messy. And is Donald Trump going to want to send U.S. troops to keep peace on the ground? I think very highly unlikely that he wants to do that. His base is very opposed to U.S. military interventions and democracy building. The old wing of the Republican Party that we saw under President George W. Bush sort of building democracy overseas, that no longer really exists in the Republican Party, and it's much more isolationist and America first. So very hard for Donald Trump to bring his supporters on board with a plan to sort of rebuild democracy in Iran.
The news was that Trump had announced that he was going to impose the 25% tariff on countries doing business with Iran. And he said that was effective immediately. What did you make of the news about these tariffs, and what do you think are going to be the potential consequences of them?
I think, to be totally honest, I think this is another example of Trump making an announcement before it's completely thought through or, vetted in the interagency process in Washington. And I think, look, there are a couple things. First of all, we don't know what these tariffs look like, what it means. There are countries that trade with Iran that already have 25% or higher tariffs. So Donald Trump could say, well, they're already being tariffed 25%. So this is not on top of that. This is, just overall 25%. The Supreme Court is expected probably tomorrow to rule on the case that's before them about whether the president is properly using his emergency authority to impose tariffs. If the court rules that he's not, then Donald Trump's threat of tariffs kind of disappears and he can blame the Supreme Court. So there are a lot of uncertainties. And I think, as is usual, when Donald Trump makes an announcement like this, we need to take a pause to kind of figure out and hear from his administration how they intend, what this is intended to look like at the end of the day.
The big question there is especially about China, because they're sort of seen as being Iran's biggest trading partner, one of the main buyers of Iranian oil, and also in light of the situation in Venezuela as well. I mean, how do you expect China to respond to this?
Well, I think China is taking a wait and see approach, because they've learned obviously by now that to not react immediately when Donald Trump announces something or puts something on Truth Social, because what matters is what's in the fine print. Sometimes the fine print never comes to pass at all. Donald Trump announces something and it never gets implemented. I'm not sure what will be the case with these 25% tariffs, but as I said, there's a reasonable possibility that if China, for example, is already tariffed at a higher than 25% rate. So if these tariffs are considered not to be in addition to existing tariffs, China's, it will have no effect on China. So I think China's waiting to see what this means.
And do you think that Trump would want to risk getting into another situation like we saw last year with that back and forth, with that tariff war?
Trump is probably fairly happy at the way the U.S.-China relationship is sort of is happening right now. Sort of is an uneasy equilibrium, I would say. Like, neither side is completely happy, but they have managed to kind of cover up the main irritants in the relationship, and is kind of, we're muddling along. We do expect there will be occasional crises in this relationship or spikes in tension, and this may very well be the cause of one. But I think both sides are intent on not getting back into a really difficult trade war situation, and I think both sides will moderate their language and their approach to avoid that.
Do you think there is a question of whether there will be any sort of negotiations between the US and Iran?
Well, Trump has floated that possibility. It's hard to imagine in at this exact moment the U.S. and Iran entering negotiations. I mean, if the U.S. is going to enter negotiations, it's going to be around Iran's nuclear program. And I think the regime in Iran is probably not in a position right now where it feels like it's ready to launch those negotiations while they're basically trying to hang on to power. I think Trump, he surprises us sometimes. And even though he got rid of the first Trump-Iran nuclear deal, he has expressed an openness to talking to Iran and to reaching another nuclear deal, not with allies like the JCPOA was, but sort of more of a bilateral agreement between the United States and Iran. So I wouldn't be completely surprised if that idea continues to percolate, but I don't think it's ripe for action at this time.
Do you think he'll be looking for support from allies?
He may be, but again, the challenge with Donald Trump is that he's antagonized many of the allies that would be helpful in this scenario, specifically the European powers, through his threats to take over Greenland. So you see how all these different things, Venezuela, Greenland, Iran, they're all connected. And so Trump has annoyed and is alienating some of his allies in Europe through his sort of threats against NATO and NATO unity and threats to make a move on Greenland. So it makes it difficult for him to then turn around and say, I know you're annoyed at me about this, but we need your help on this. So it's all connected. And I think Donald Trump is in a position where his inclination is to do these things without allies. And I think that's probably where we're headed.
Do you think there is something behind the timing of all of this? As you mentioned, that with Venezuela, Greenland, now potentially Iran as well.
It's hard to say. I think, there are theories that this is all trying to distract from the Epstein files and some of the domestic issues that Donald Trump is facing. And he is polling very negatively in the United States. Americans do not have confidence in his ability to manage the economy. Affordability continues to be a difficult issue for Trump and for Republicans, and Democrats are hammering on that message. So, this could be seen as a way to try to distract. But, the Greenland thing, Trump's been talking about that for a long time. So I think it's in some ways a bit coincidental that these things are all happening. I mean, certainly the U.S. had nothing to do with the timing of the Iran protests. So I would say it's more coincidental.
Well, Lewis Lukens, thank you so much for joining me on the Trump Report today.
All right. Thanks, Joe.